June 6, 1944. At West Point, New York, a young second lieutenant named John Eisenhower stands in the ranks at his graduation ceremony. On the same morning, 4,000 miles away, his father is launching the largest invasion in the history of warfare onto the beaches of Normandy. The cadets of the class of 1944 are told the news as they graduate. The invasion has begun. John Eisenhower receives his commission on the most important day of his father's life, a day his father might not survive, professionally or otherwise. And John is about to go to that same war, carrying a name that makes him both a soldier and a target, since John Sheldon Dowd Eisenhower was the only living child of Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower. They had once had another son, a little boy nicknamed Ike, who died of scarlet fever in 1921 at the age of 3. It was the great grief of Dwight Eisenhower's life, a wound he never fully healed. John was the son who lived, and now in 1944 that only surviving son was a newly commissioned army officer heading into a world war his own father was commanding. For the Supreme Allied Commander, the invasion of Europe and the safety of his only child had arrived on the very same day. But to understand the strange, constrained war John Eisenhower was about to fight, and why the son of the most powerful general in the world would spend his life half in his father's shadow and half trying to step out of it, we have to understand the impossible position his name created. So John was a competent, serious young officer who wanted, like any West Pointer, to lead men in combat. But he was also the one human being on Earth whose capture could be used as leverage against the Supreme Allied Commander. If the Germans took Eisenhower's son prisoner, the propaganda value would be incalculable. That single fact would shape everything. The problem was recognized at the highest levels. General George Marshall himself took an interest in where John could safely serve. The decision was made, quietly, that John Eisenhower would not be placed in a frontline role where he was likely to be captured. He would serve, he would go to Europe, he would do real work. But he would be kept away from the kind of combat that might put him in German hands. For a young officer trained to fight, it was a kind of gilded cage. He had the uniform, the commission, and the will, but the one thing he most wanted, the chance to prove himself in battle like his classmates, was the one thing his name forbade. In the spring of 1945, John Eisenhower went to Europe and served on the staff, observing operations, carrying out assignments, learning the war from inside the headquarters his father commanded. He visited the front. He saw the destruction. He spent time with his father when duty allowed, a surreal experience, the young lieutenant and the 5-star Supreme Commander, father and son, in the middle of the largest war in history. But John was always aware of the invisible line drawn around him. Other men his age, his West Point classmates, were leading platoons and dying. John was being protected. It was not a comfortable thing to carry. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, only a few weeks after John arrived in any real capacity. He had served honorably, but he had not led men in the great battles, and he knew it. For the son of the man who had commanded the whole Allied effort, it was a complicated inheritance. Pride in his father mixed with a private frustration that his own war had been fought with the brakes on. He could have traded on the name for the rest of his life. Instead, he set out to build a real career as an army officer on his own merits, in a peacetime army where everyone knew exactly whose son he was. That was its own challenge. Every assignment, every promotion, every evaluation came with an unspoken question. Was John Eisenhower being advanced because he was good or because of his father? John felt it acutely. He worked to be taken seriously as an officer in his own right, not as the general's son and, after 1952, the president's son. Because in that year, Dwight Eisenhower was elected President of the United States, and John's situation went from difficult to nearly impossible. Now, he was not just the famous general's boy. He was the sitting president's only son in uniform in an army at war again, this time in Korea. What happened to John Eisenhower in Korea is the part that finally let him answer the question he had carried since D-Day. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We are just getting to it. By the time John served in the Korean War, he was determined to see real combat, to do what he had been kept from in the last war. He served as a staff officer in a frontline infantry division closer to the fighting than he had ever been allowed. But once again, the old fear returned in a new form. His father was now president-elect, and the capture of the president's son by the communists was a nightmare Washington would not allow. And so, even in Korea, John Eisenhower fought the war with a leash on. He was given duties that kept him useful, but, where possible, out of the highest risk situations. He performed well and earned the respect of the officers around him. But the pattern of his military life was now clear and probably permanent. He would always be the son who could not be allowed to be an ordinary soldier, because his name made him extraordinary in a way that had nothing to do with anything he himself did. By the time the Korean War ended, John was a seasoned officer in his 30s with a real record and a growing sense that his future might lie somewhere other than the battlefield. John Eisenhower had something his father's other aides and generals did not. He had grown up inside the highest levels of the American military. Watching, listening, absorbing. He understood war not just as a soldier, but as a witness to how it was commanded at the very top. And he could write. As his military career matured, John began to turn that rare vantage point into a second vocation. He would become a historian, and not just any historian, but one who would write with authority about the very war his father had commanded. The general's son was about to become the chronicler of the General's War. In 1969, John Eisenhower published a book called The Bitter Woods, a detailed, deeply researched history of the Battle of the Bulge, the desperate German offensive of December 1944 that his father had commanded the response to. It was widely praised. It was not a son's tribute. It was a serious work of military history, clear-eyed about mistakes and command failures, including those of the American High Command. John Eisenhower had done something remarkable. He had written about his father's war as a professional historian with honesty and earned respect for the work on its own terms. The Bitter Woods was only the beginning. Over the following decades, John Eisenhower wrote a shelf of well-regarded history books on the First World War, on the Mexican-American War, on the American generals of the Second World War, on the alliance his father had led. He edited his father's wartime letters. He became, in the judgment of his peers, a genuine and gifted military historian, not a celebrity dabbler. The son who had been kept from fully fighting the war had found a way to serve it after all, by making sure it was understood accurately by the generations who came after. John's life held one more major chapter of public service. In 1969, the same year The Bitter Woods appeared, President Richard Nixon, whose daughter Julie had married John's son David, appointed John Eisenhower as the United States ambassador to Belgium. He served in Brussels for 2 years, representing his country in the heart of the Europe his father had helped liberate. And, in March of that same year, between the book and the ambassadorship, the central figure of John's entire life died. Dwight Eisenhower, general, president, father, passed away, and John, at last, stepped fully into a world without the shadow that had defined him. John Eisenhower lived a long, productive life after his father's death. He continued to write history into his old age, producing respected books well into his 70s and 80s. His son, David Eisenhower, named for the grandfather, became a writer and academic, and the Eisenhower name continued into American public life through the family Nixon had married into. John had built in the end exactly what he had set out to build, a record of genuine achievement that was his own, even as it remained forever entwined with the most famous name of his era. He had made peace with being an Eisenhower. There is a question buried in John Eisenhower's war that is worth asking, honestly. Was it right to protect him? While John was kept from frontline capture, hundreds of thousands of other American sons, including the only sons of other families, fought and died in the same war with no special line drawn around them. The Sullivan brothers had died together on one ship. The Nyland brothers had been shattered. Why should the Supreme Commander's son be shielded when so many others were not? The answer the army gave was practical. His capture was a strategic liability, not a personal favor. But to the families of the dead, the distinction may have felt thin. And yet there is the other side. John Eisenhower did not ask to be protected. He wanted to fight, and the protection was imposed on him, against his own wishes, by forces far above him. The shield around him was not a privilege he sought. It was a burden he carried. The knowledge that he could never simply be a soldier, that his every success would be doubted and his every risk forbidden, because of an accident of birth. He spent his whole life proving he was more than his name, in the army and then in the writing of history. The protection that kept him alive also kept him, in a sense, from ever being fully his own man. So how should we see John Eisenhower? As a son unfairly shielded while other men's sons died, or as a man who carried the heaviest name of his generation with dignity, served honestly in 2 wars under impossible constraints, and then spent decades making sure the war his father commanded was remembered truthfully. Both readings have weight. He did not choose his father, his name, or the cage it built around him. He chose only what to do inside it, and what he did was serve and then write, and never once trade on the name for something he had not earned. That choice was his alone. John Sheldon Dowd Eisenhower died on December 21st, 2013. In Trappe, Maryland, he was 91 years old. He had graduated from West Point on the morning his father launched D-Day, served in 2 wars with a protective leash he never asked for, risen to brigadier general, served as an ambassador, and become one of the respected military historians of his time. The only surviving son of the most famous soldier of the age. The lieutenant who was forbidden to be captured, the man who could not fully fight his father's war, and so spent his life making sure the world understood it. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family have graduated from Point, served in the European theater under Eisenhower, fought in the Battle of the Bulge, or served in the Korean War that John Eisenhower knew, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, one thing they said, one thing you remember. The men who were there deserve more than a name in a database. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.